Okay, so today I wanted to talk about two dynamic processes that are changing the world, but also the way we imagine the future of the world. So on the one hand, there is this extraordinary rise in the use and in the power of artificial intelligence. And on the other hand, there's an escalating global environmental degradation. And over the course of the 20 to 25 minutes, I will be using the works of contemporary artists to illustrate the connection between AI and the environment. Sometimes, to me, it feels as if the experts in the field of AI or in the field of the environment, they don't really talk to one another. And when they do, I suspect that their dialogue is a bit artificial and cursory, because very regularly you can read in the media kind of feel-good stories about how the AI can be deployed to fight against illegal logging, to protect biodiversity. This is a face recognition technology that can identify every single chimpanzee in order to help fight against wildlife trafficking. And so you have stories like that that promise that AI is going to help manage resources and basically save the planet. The problem is that I think very often the people behind these projects, they forget that in order to function, AI requires processes, infrastructures, buildings, and devices that are extremely energy intensive and resource hungry. And this is going to have a detrimental impact on the future of ecosystems. Sometimes I feel that many of us have lost track of the very physical, the material and even the geological dimension of technology. And even the vocabulary that we use to describe today's technology is really failing completely to reflect this materiality of the digital. So for example, we talk about virtual, intangible, immaterial. We use expressions like cloud computing or fog computing. So there is this huge divide, this kind of discrepancy between the materiality of the technology and the perception we have of it. And that was not always like that. In the past, we used to have a fairly good idea of what the physical infrastructure of communication technology looked like. So allow me to take you back in time. In the 19th century, we are in Stockholm, the capital of Sweden, and where there was this so-called telephone tornet. So it's a telephone tower. It was a metallic structure that was built to connect something like over 5,000 telephone lines in Stockholm. And because of the technological limitation of the time, every telephone required to have its own physical line to be connected, that would connect a physical line that would connect a house or a business to a phone exchange where the call was manually connected by a live operator. That meant that if you were living in Stockholm at the time, you would raise your head and be able, more or less, to figure out how the new telephone technology was functioning. And of course, it is very, very different today. We are led to believe that this technology is immaterial, that it's intangible, to the point that we don't really know what technology looks like. And I think that we can find a clear example of our lack of familiarity with internet infrastructure in the work of Mario Santamaria. So he's a Spanish artist who examined a number of US patent databases, and he isolated the drawings of internet representations that he was finding in the patent. So I'm going to show a few images of it. You see how inventors are representing today how they imagine the internet to look like. So at best, it looks like a cloud. Most of the time, it looks like blobs, like shapeless forms with very, very vague contours. And this is how someone is imagining the blockchain. But of course, the reality is very different, and I'm sure you know it, because the internet is a very physical space. It's full of machines and people, and it relies on very energy and resource-intensive infrastructures. So I'm going to show the work of a few contemporary photographers who have tried to investigate what the internet looked like exactly. So in this photo, you have the inside of a Carrier hotel. So it's a place where many networks are converging to form a single larger network. And what's inside this carrier hotel, which is located in Manhattan, by the way, the photographer found hundreds of fiber optic cables, servers, machinery, technicians. I think, sorry, for me, the most moving image of what the internet looks like is this photo. So it shows the place where the submarine telecommunication cables that are really stretching across the Atlantic Ocean. They leave from the coast of England, and then they emerge directly into the headquarters of this company in the US. And it enables people living in, on two different continents to talk to each other. This is also a photo I found very moving. This is a beach that looks like any normal beach, but actually beneath the sand are the cables that are connecting the African continent with the rest of the world. And sometimes it's even more difficult to identify the internet infrastructure because, as in this case, it's hidden in the shape of a tree. And when talking about internet infrastructure, it's difficult not to mention the kind of poster boy of the carbon footprint of digital technology, which is the data center. So here you see the inside of one of Google's data center. And you might know it, but Google is using an artificial intelligence in order to optimize the cooling systems of its data center. And with this AI, they managed to reduce their energy consumption by 30%. Similarly, Alibaba is using a cooling technology that, as they say, is allowing the company to save over 70% of energy. And, I could multiply the example. I could tell you that Apple and Facebook are using the so-called green energy in order to reduce the carbon footprint of their operations. So this is Jeff Bezos from Amazon. But what these images are showing are little more than operations of greenwashing, because actually, the more we optimize energy consumption in data center or elsewhere, the more we consume energy. And I know this sounds completely counterintuitive, but we've known since the 19th century, we've known since the time of this gentleman actually, that energy efficiency gains can have what is called a rebound effect. And we call this effect the Gervans Paradox, from the name of this British economist, who was living at the time of the Industrial Revolution in England. So it was the time of the steam engine and the coal. And he wrote a book called The Coal Questions, in which Gervans argued that any efficiency gain brought about by the improvement of coal-powered steam engines was boosting the overall consumption of coal, of iron, and other resources. And a simple way to explain that is that as the machines of the Industrial Revolution were becoming less energy intensive and less expensive to run, well, the industrialists found new ways to use these machines. They simply innovated and ended up using the machines even more. And something very similar, of course, is happening today, because data center, of course, they're becoming more efficient, but we are also consuming and producing more and more data, which of course means that we consume more and more natural resources. I'm going to give an example by one artist who felt that there was this need to visualize the environmental impact of digital technology. So Joanna Moll, a few years ago, looked at google.com, which was the most visited site on the internet. And if you go on our website and you clicked on the word deforest, you will arrive on a web page that will show you the number of trees that are needed to absorb the amount of CO2 derived from the global visits to the search engine every single second. So every single second, we would need on average 23 trees in order to compensate for the greenhouse gas emissions of the search engine. So it's a very rough estimation, but at least it shows, it makes visible the environmental cost of digital technology. And I mean, I could multiply the example, but I also want to tell you something I'm sure you know already, that anything associated with digital technology and artificial intelligence, whether it's the smart thermostat, the autonomous car, the Internet of Things, even the green energy appliances, or the cables or the data center, they cast a very long and toxic shadow over ecosystems because their production involves the extraction of mineral resources in places that have, you know, fairly poor human rights, labor, and environmental records. They also generate waste and e-waste when people, you know, they replace an old technology and want to use a new one. And from a purely geological point of view, this is a source of concern because, as maybe you can see on this periodic table, elements that are crucial to the modern world may become prohibitively scarce. So they're not going to disappear in the coming decades, but it's going to be increasingly difficult to extract them. It's going to require more money and more resources. And elements like gallium or indium, which are needed both to make telephones, any digital technology, but also green technologies. They are going to be in short supply. And I want to say something, let's see, yeah. I want to say something about a French physicist whose work I found very interesting. So he's called José Alloy, and he says that the technologies we are using them now and the technologies that make AI possible and the technologies of tomorrow are what he calls zombie technologies. Because to him, zombie technologies are based on materials and on resources that are finite and that are not renewable. The zombies technologies that we are using have a relatively short time of existence, or think about how long you keep a mobile phone. Usually it's a couple of years. And also finally, zombie technologies have components that are not part of any biochemical cycle. So they end up producing waste that do not disappear and it will continue to exist in the form of debris for millions of years. So in short, we have devised these technologies, these zombies technologies, quite a long time ago. You know, the mobile phones has been here for a long time. But we devised these technologies at a time when we really believed that we could afford to completely ignore the boundaries of planetary resources. And so these technologies, what they're doing is actually serving an obsolete future that is completely out of sync with the world's most urgent concern today, which is, of course, global warming and the disparition of natural resources. So clearly, the infrastructure, the processes, the devices required to deploy artificial intelligence are already damaging the planet and its future. But I've also been wondering, is the opposite true? Like, could climate change and its consequences also put the bright future of AI at risk? And I think that the answer is yes, because if we look very closely, we are already seeing signs that indicate that global warming is putting a strain on digital technology and on its future. So I'm going to talk about two examples. One is research that was done by a researcher at Madison University in Wisconsin, and they wanted to assess the risk that climate change, and in particular sea level rise, can cause to internet infrastructure. So the researchers found that fiber optic cables that are buried under the ground in densely populated coastal regions in the US, so in cities like Miami, Seattle, and New York, they may soon, by 2033, they may soon be completely inundated by rising sea levels. And they will face this problem because when the cables were installed, when the infrastructure of the internet was built, it was something like 20 years ago. And of course, at the time, no one was thinking about climate change and the possibility of the sea to rise. And so the cables they used under the ground are not waterproof. Like the cables that are under the oceans, yes, or on the ocean are waterproof, but not the ones that are in cities. So it might create a big problem. And then my second example is bringing us to Taiwan, which you probably know is the place where 90% of the most advanced semiconductor microchips are being manufactured today. And these microchips are essential for the global electronic sector. And there is now a shortage of these microchips. There's a number of reasons for that. I'm not going to get into details. There is the pandemic, there's the geopolitics. And then there is another factor that is, I think, a bit undiscussed. It's the fact that Taiwan is going through an unusually long period of dry weather this year. And actually, according to an expert in climate change in Taiwan, the country has been suffering from a significant decrease in the number of rainy days every year since the 1960s. So that means that that's a big problem for the manufacturer of chips, because of microchips, because they need a lot of water, in particular to clean the wafers. And the result of that is that finally, both the government of Taiwan and the manufacturers of microchips are starting to pay attention to the management of natural resources like water, and to the possibility of climate change affecting the production of microchips. So I'm going to end with only two artworks. The first one is by Sterling Crispin, who created these 4 totems, and each of these totems is representing one of the pillars of the technological singularity. So there is information technology, cognitive science, nanotechnology, and biotechnology. Each of the totems that you see comes with 100 shares in one of these companies that represent either nanotechnology, biotechnology, etc. And also with a small computer that is monitoring the stock prices of this technology. So by buying one of these sculptures, you are literally investing in these technologies and casting your vote for the future that is that Silicon Valley is asking us to feel so excited about. But I'm hoping that the images I've been showing earlier has demonstrated that the future is maybe not going to go that smoothly, maybe not going to go in the direction of what the Silicon Valley wants. I'm talking about the Silicon Valley, but I'm assuming in China or in the rest of Asia, there was also this dream of an AI technology taking over the world and making our lives wonderful. Anyway, so things could go in another direction. So that's why the artist also added to this sculpture an emergency food ration with a lifesaver jerrycan. It's a kind of water filter that enables a family of 4 persons to survive for 2 years. So in fact, each totem is both a sculpture and a very useful object. It is both an investment strategy in the future and also a survival kit if things go wrong. So it's depicting a future where humans will be either becoming completely obsolete because robots will be much smarter and will be taking over, or humans will be completely overwhelmed as a result of unmanageable environmental catastrophe. So it's a word that expresses a lot of anxiety for the future. And it's also a word that I think is based on the personal experience of the artist, because when he developed the work, he was living in California. And you probably know that California is experiencing also very dry weather with heavy fires. People are asked not to use too much water. So that means that the artist was living in a place that was, going through really harsh environmental conditions, but also California is also the home of the Silicon Valley, and it's its relentless optimism about the future. So I think the work I was really creating new dialogues that were challenging existing contradictory narratives about the future. And I will end with a work by Tegabre and Julian Oliver and Bengt Schoelen. So they made an AI-driven autonomous environmental manager that is combining a supercomputer and also a neural network that monitor live satellites, social media, data about geology, about biodiversity, about the climate, about topography, and about population. And the goal of the AI is to simulate a geoengineering process that would correct and solve and fix the environmental problems that parts of the world are facing. So as case studies, I mean, this one was the Silicon Valley. They also use as a case studies regions like the Arctic or the Brazilian rainforest, or cities like Vienna and Dubai. This is Dubai. And you can see how the AI is working on there are three screens. On the left, you see how the AI is analyzing the data. In the center, how the AI is calculating and making suggestions. And on the right side, you see what would happen if, you gave AI the mission to transform the planet in order to solve local environmental challenges. And the reason I think they're a little bit brutal and unpleasant for humans, because the AI would suggest to relocate or completely erase cities, or elsewhere the AI says, oh, you should move this mine of lithium and install it closer to the production facilities of technology. Also, the AI wants to plant more forests, to straighten coastline. And over time, obviously, a new planet is emerging. Another detail I found interesting about the work is that the computer itself requires a colossal amount of processing power in order to, on the one hand, analyze the vast amount of data, but also to run the climate models it's using. And that, of course, is further undermining the idea that the salvation of the planet resides only in the hands of AI. And another problem I see with AI trying to solve the environmental crisis is that ecosystems are simply too fragile, too complex, and too interconnected to be mathematically optimized. The environment is not a rule-based system. It's changing in unprecedented and non-linear ways that are really challenging AI's assumptions that the past is representative of the future. So I'm going to conclude by saying that I'm hoping this presentation was a kind of quiet warning that we should not be blinded by the promises made by AI developers in the fields of sustainability, climate mitigation, and the conservation of ecosystems. I think we should be very cautious about any form of techno-optimism and techno-solutionism. And then in addition, AI has, I think, very little power to confront the underlying political and socio-economic forces that are exploiting nature for profit. And I'm going to give a very, very simple, very mundane example of that, that will, I'm hoping, illustrate my point. So, for example, you can make an Amazon or an Alibaba data center or warehouse more energy efficient, but it's not going to be very useful if you don't change the demand for next day delivery, if you keep on promoting turbo consumerism, and if you're not casting a critical eye on the promises of technology. So I'm going to close here. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope you heard me well.
Régine, this is very interesting, and we tend to believe that AI is an immaterial thing, something that is just in our mind and it's just floating in air. But really, there is a infrastructure that has a physical, material consequences on the planet, I guess. And I think this is because from my point of view, from the authorship point of view, really what you're doing is using AI against AI in a way. I mean, you're just kind of like counter-arguing the AI that is being used for the benefit of humanity, but it doesn't. So therefore, the AI that you create is the anti-AI for the one that is supposedly for our benefit. But I'm sorry, but for the interest of time, because I've been told here that we have to move on, I would like to thank you very much and appreciate your work. Very interesting. We need to move on. Thank you so much. Give a hand to her.
Thank you.
Thank you, Regina.
Merci.
Okay.